Hi, it's Elio from the Collab. I'm here today on August 17th, 2022, with Peter Luo, who has some really exciting stuff to talk about. I don't want to steal your thunder and give away what's coming down the pipeline. And
hmm
so let's just start open. Peter, talk about yourself, why we're here. What do you do?
Yeah. Thanks. Really excited to be here. Some of the work the collaboratory has put out has been really, really awesome. So I'm honored to, be able to hop onto this short discussion and conversation. So my name is Peter. I just finished my first year studying user experience design at the University of Toronto iSchool. And so for this summer, I've joined the Critical Digital Humanities Initiative as a UX designer co-op. And basically, I'm kind of leased out by the CDHI to these four research teams to help with their research mobilization efforts. So some of them want to make a website for their research. Some people want a digital exhibit, and that's where Elspeth or the LGBT Collaboratory project is landing. And so currently for the past 7 weeks, I think, so this is an 8-week project, I've been helping the collaboratory basically design their digital exhibit on the Pussy Palace raid, which is a raid that took place in the 2000s by the Toronto Police on a Pussy Palace, which is and correct me if I'm wrong because I think you know more than me on this, a predominantly lesbian kind of sex club or
Yeah,
something like that.
predominantly lesbian, but also open to trans folks and other people who fit basically in the non-cis man category. It
hmm
was a sex party, an annual sex party where the queer women and trans people took over a bathhouse, which is in the history of gay and lesbian community and culture, a predominantly gay male space, and so it was
Yeah.
kind of a way to take some of that space for themselves and throw a really cool party, which
hmm
in 2000 was raided by the Toronto police, and they kind of crashed the cool party, sadly.
hmm hmm Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I can the exhibit is centered around creating an interactive experience for users to explore the palace as it was back then, using a lot of illustrations from Ayo, who is a really great illustrator from the collaboratory, but also to showcase kind of the narrative of the raid. And so my job has to been to kind of design the look and feel of it, but also a lot of it has been to engage with a lot of conversations and discussions with Alicia and Elspeth, who had this project from the collaboratory, to try to decide what form this exhibit will take, and also to just scope out how much content we'll put in there, how big does the project get, what is possible, especially with bringing up the DHN developer, DHN or CDHI developer, who will be working on this project after my co-op term ends, bringing him on to discuss like what is actually possible from a development perspective. So that's been my work for the past 8 weeks with the collaboratory.
Awesome. I want to back up again just for the kind of more traditional oral historians and kind of non-digital people who are
hmm
listening to this and being like, what are you talking about? Can you explain a little bit about what UX design is, how it's usually used, how it's a useful tool?
hmm
Just kind of give the crash course on what it is exactly that you're talking about.
Yeah. So if you've never heard of UX design, then please don't feel bad at all because it is a relatively new field of, I guess, studies, but also a kind of career choice. It kind of came out of human-computer interaction. And I think that kind of gives you an idea of what it is. Basically, UX design is here to kind of challenge a lot of what is traditional thinking when it comes to the delivery of product or digital interfaces. So traditionally, people or organizations will kind of think up a product and then think what they want to sell to the customers and the users, and then they will make that. But a lot of times, you're not actually accounting for what the user needs, and the user need could range from, do I actually need this product, to how do I interact with this product and what kind of look and feel does this product have? So the user experience designer or UX design as a field is kind of introducing this new style of design thinking where it focuses on the user. And so there's always emphasis on conducting user research and trying to understand users as best as we can, and to try to introduce this new kind of perspective to challenge or create a new perspective that, you know, traditional organizations or projects might not really think about. I will say a caveat here, in that the user research aspect of UX design, which is one of its main values, can sometimes be skipped over because it is a very resource heavy kind of work. You have to find the right people. Ideally, you find the right people. You run tests, whether that be interviews, surveys, you know, types of methods to gather data and to understand their behavior and their needs, and then you base your product or your design on that research. But of course, as mentioned, that takes a lot of time, and that usually involves compensation to the user. So there are also smaller companies these days will employ other user research methods, such as kind of competitive research, or also in cases like this where there's, you know, it's smaller projects, we might leverage kind of the network of, you know, people involved with the project. But in bigger companies, they definitely conduct this user research. And ultimately, UX design is about kind of focusing the product on the user and making sure that its aesthetics, its look and feel, how someone interacts with it, and the value it delivers is centered on the user. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially, you know, hearing how it's used in industry and how often you would go straight to the consumer, do some surveys and figure out what, you know, what the user needs or wants out of a product. That sounds a little bit different than the kind of work that you're doing for the collaboratory and on this Pussy Palace exhibit, because, you know, we're not talking to the users, or you're not talking to the users, you're just talking to the research team, which has predominantly been Elspeth, Alicia, and Io on this one. So how does that work? What kind of dynamics change? What kind of work have you been able to do? Just take us through a little bit of the kinds of conversations you've been having about what the team imagines that a user might want out of this exhibition.
Yeah, so that's one of, I think, the main things that I was able to learn through this co-op, because I think in the classroom, you are able to design and conduct research without any sort of limitations, because you are able to get access to a lot of your classmates and then conduct research on them. You're also kind of designing without a budget. But in this, excuse me, in this case, obviously, we don't have time and budget to actually do a big enough kind of, you know, survey or interview project to understand their needs, especially when a project like this is kind of different from industry, where it's showcasing something from within. You're not creating a product to match a user need. You're kind of, it's a showcase.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that there is no room for user-centric design or design thinking, because you're creating a website and you want to showcase your research or a story. But what if that website is clunky to use? It's unintuitive. What if the user, when they arrive on the website, they're interested in what you have to say, but because it's so confusing and they don't know how to navigate it, they just give up and then they leave. I think that's what happens to a lot of us, right? When we go to a new website, when we see a new digital interface, if it's unintuitive, especially with our shorter attention spans these days, it's very easy to hop out. So my job has been to try to bring as much attention to user behavior and user expectations in regards to web browser interfaces and how they interact with web browser interfaces without conducting user research. And so a lot of the time that's, when Elspeth or Alicia propose something, I might try to kind of be like, okay, hey, but if we put the button here, or if we don't give a visual indicator to an important thing we want to showcase, does that create confusion for the user? Does it draw enough attention for the user to click on it, right? Another example is, you are still able to kind of talk about the user's actual needs beyond the digital interface. So one example is in the collaboratory currently, we are designing for desktop, but we also have a design for mobile for the long term.
Okay.
And so obviously, when it comes to mobile, you're working with much less space than a browser. So there's much less things that you can put on it. And when it comes to mobile, users also have different expectations. When we go on desktop, we are more we're more likely to consume content that is longer because we are sitting there. But on mobile, we're used to, doing other things while we're looking at, like perhaps listening to audio, or we're only used to kind of consuming content that's a little shorter because there's a higher likelihood that you're on the go when you're using mobile, right? Whereas for desktop, you can mostly guarantee that they're going to be in one place for an extended period of time.
Right.
So one example of this introducing the idea of user-centric thinking and design thinking was that when we were designing for more mobile, I brought up the idea that I was worried that the audio content that this exhibit will have for the users to listen to, they're usually maybe like 1 to 2 minutes. And then ideally the user would switch to another piece of content and then continue listening for 1 to 2 minutes. But on mobile, that becomes a little difficult because then they have to hold their phone for 1 to 2 minutes, and then they have to click on something, press something else to listen to that content.
Mhm.
Or when they're listening, they might want to kind of like tab out of that screen, right? Like when you listen to
Right.
Spotify, you're never staring at your Spotify screen, you're
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
something else. Um, or kind of like another user behavior when it comes to consuming audio on mobile that is common is podcasts,
Right.
really long form audio content, right? So we were in a trouble where a little kind of an icky situation where the length of the audio content we were offering meant that it wasn't long enough for users to be able to consume in the background.
Mhm.
And it wasn't short enough for users to be able to kind of like click through the different
Right.
audio content to listen to them, right? So that led us to think more about, okay, should we now then have different audio content on mobile because user behavior and user expectations on mobile when it comes to consuming audio is completely different than compared to desktop. So as you can see, like design thinking goes be like has kind of like both aspects. One is like the details of an interface and how to interact with it. But at the same time, as seen from the example I just gave, you also introduce the idea of making sure that the whole concept of your project is also centered on the user's needs.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. So much to think about. I have so many questions. One of them, I think, importantly, just being how does all of this factor into what you're doing for the Pussy Palace Oral History Project materials? But I think it might actually be more helpful if we did a bit of a demo and you
Yeah.
visualized it while you can talk about it, just because,
Mhm.
you know, like you said, it's different to see it and to have the time to sit and do all of that stuff than
Yeah, sure.
kind of whatever. So I will share my screen, or allow you.
I think I am able to already, so I'll
All right.
just go ahead if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Um, so, oh, okay. So kind of this is like a leak of like the background of kind of the process of I guess I can go through this too. The process of kind of what a UX designer will do for a project such as this. And I think, the first thing I'll talk about is how I was able to through discussions with Alicia and Elspeth, kind of push the project to a more defined status compared to before.
Mhm.
So previously, we had a very, very general idea of, okay, we want this exhibit to have some sort of interaction. And Alicia had this great idea of being able to kind of move through different rooms of the palace and explore them. And so this is a low fidelity design. And what that means, low fidelity, is basically when you don't put a lot of effort into the visual feel and look of your design, and
Mhm.
you mostly spend time on trying to think about um, the basics of this website. So like, okay, if we are going to explore the palace, how are we going to do it, right? For example, here, the idea is like, okay, we want to be able to click on these different objects and then to get content on the left side. But whereas in the room, not only are you able to click on things to get content on this left bar, you're also clicking on kind of signifiers to enter into the next room, right? So
Mhm.
you click on this to enter the dance floor.
Right.
And so a lot of low fidelity is making sure that you don't spend too much time on the details of the visual interface,
Mhm.
but having something that does exist to showcase how a user would essentially interact with your website.
Mhm.
And I think being able to go through this step-by-step process, as you can see, there's a lot of ideation that goes on.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot of like frames that go on, but being able to kind of go through this process of kind of deciding on the interaction, then working on the visual aesthetics to decide on the aesthetics, I think that process helps push the project into a more defined state because now you have something to anchor your ideas off of. If I wasn't here, or if there wasn't kind of a UX designer here to design these interactions and design the pages, it would just be a Word document essentially, right? And that's very hard to communicate when you're using text to explain something that is as sophisticated as an entire website. So now I'm just going to show you kind of a prototype, and I think prototyping, along with, as mentioned, low fidelity and mid fidelity wireframing, are both large at our values, like are both value that UX designers can bring to a broad project. So wireframing is, as you can see here, designing what the website would look like when you develop them. But then prototyping kind of simulates how the actual website would look and feel like by creating connections between these different pages, as you saw, like the rectangles, and then making them interactable so that it simulates what a real website would look like.
Right.
So as you can see, for example, here we have the home page where it's, different pieces of content that would be on this website. So before the palace, building the palace, explore the palace, after the palace. So you can click on them just as you would a real website
Right.
and see what it's like. You can click on all the different categories. And so right now I'll click on explore the palace. Obviously, the animations and the visuals aren't completely smoothed out yet, but
Right.
being able to prototype them and connect these pages and simulate an actual web browser experience, I think is really important to see what is missing or what problems we might run into.
Right.
So here you begin your journey. It turns into the illustration that Io has made for the palace, and then you enter the palace. And so I think here we have examples of, I guess, how UX design helps a project mature and change and evolve through the process of low fidelity to mid fidelity.
Mhm.
So if you'll recall just now, we had, you know, the initial design was to have kind of like highlights in this room, and then you would click on them and you would be able to go, like, for example, to the dance floor. Um, and there might, because rooms are not linear, there might be another door that might go to the bar, right?
Mhm.
And so, but through this process of kind of evolving, like maturing the idea, we realized that um, that would be confusing for the user
Mhm.
because if a user wanted to explore the palace as a whole and consume all the content that is available in the palace through these interactable objects that you
Mhm.
click on to learn more, they're bound to um, revisit a lot of these rooms, right?
Right.
Because you're kind of in a maze.
Yeah.
And what's important here is also that Alicia, or kind of the team behind this project, had mentioned that through their interviews with past participants of this palace, it was like a maze. And
Yes.
that kind of brings up the issue of, okay, how do you balance user needs with your own needs, right?
Mhm.
Because to be completely accurate, this form of content of visiting rooms and having illustrations and interact with them is meant to stimulate uh, kind of the experiences of a patron or a visitor back then. And
Yes.
so it would be accurate if the user ran into a lot of confusion and visited a room 3 times to try to find the door to a room they haven't visited yet. But then that clashes with their needs because you don't want to create so much confusion that they're going to get mad and then like close the window, right? Like close
Right.
the browser and close the website. It's that easy for them.
Mhm.
And so eventually we decided to kind of go with a more linear way where the user is kind of guided towards a linear path that ensures that they're able to explore the entire palace and all its content. But at the same time, we also give the user a choice. For example, oh, I guess this was an old prototype. But for example, in order to allow for some sort of user freedom, we also created a floor plan so that a user is able to open the map and it'll show what room they're currently in and what rooms they have yet to visit, and then they'd be able to choose that way. And so that's kind of like a very brief rundown of like the project and its interactions. Obviously, it has evolved a lot since then, but I would say that I think hopefully that kind of highlighted how a UX designer can help a project move along and kind of also some of the challenges that a UX designer would face, and also kind of at the same time how they get over it with the project team.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was very clear, very detailed, also very exciting. If you want to stop sharing your screen now,
Sure.
you can go ahead, just so we're back to being the two of us. I have two questions left for you. One that I think flows very naturally. What about using UX design and doing this particular project has been most fulfilling, exciting, interesting to you?
Yeah, I think it would be, as mentioned earlier, seeing the project evolve from, a Word document into a fully interactive prototype, where we're starting to go into the details of, okay, what colors should we use? How much visual glow should we put on these objects to indicate that they can be clicked on and that the user can then consume the audio content? I think, going from that stage to where we are now, through just 8 weeks has been extremely fulfilling for me, especially because during these meetings, there's a lot of amazing conversations going on. There's a lot of ideation. So, obviously through the design process, you're coming up with different solutions to a problem or different ways to present something. And even though only one will eventually go through, or even none, I think that process of talking with Alicia, Elspeth, and being able to kind of think outside the box and think freely and just propose things without kind of being worried because you're not actually like making anything yet. You're not investing resources and time on it. Like I can just draw it and it might take 30 minutes. That won't take long, right? Being able to do that has been extremely fun in the meetings. And also just to kind of like being able to iron out the specific details to prepare for a handoff to the developer. I think it's like, oh, you're finally seeing something that's been worked on for so long kind of be created in a visual sense and ready to actually launch into a product to our users or our readers or our customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm gonna leave the final question kind of off of what you just said, because I'm continuing to think about how these kinds of tools and thinking seems very industry specific. You're using words like consumer, product, that kind of thing. How can UX design help academics more broadly think more capaciously about something like accessibility? And how can you imagine that UX design can be used across other oral history or academically oriented projects in the future in your utopic world?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think at the beginning of this interview, UX design is itself like a relatively new kind of path that people aren't really aware of yet. And I think after taking an accessibility course, I'm starting to feel that accessibility is also a rising kind of idea within the School of Design. And accessibility is tricky because you can't really create design principles like you can for UX design for accessibility, because accessibility is such a large umbrella term that covers so many different accessible needs. Someone who is visually impaired would be using a computer completely different from someone who is maybe has issues with hearing, right? And so you can't really create these what we call good design or good design principles with with UX design. But I think I think the connection between UX design and accessibility is quite nice, because if you think about it, UX design is already user-centric, and what is more requiring of user-centric than accessibility? right? Because with accessibility, with UX design, let's say, there's so many digital interfaces out there and apps and websites out there that there are trends that exist that users are used to and are comfortable with, and we can empathize with them.
Mhm.
But for example, one of the projects that I did, a school project, so not a real project, but still, in the accessibility course, was trying to design a vending machine for someone who is visually impaired.
Mhm.
And through that process, you realize how difficult it is for you to even be able to imagine how a visually impaired person would interact with a vending machine.
Mhm.
I think through the process, you're like, I think I ran into a lot of experiences where it's like, oh, this is a great idea. Oh, wait, sorry, I forgot they're visually impaired. That's completely, I can't do that anymore. It's so hard to be able to empathize. And so I think accessibility requires a lot of engagement with someone who is kind of like has that accessible need. But at
Mhm.
the same time, I also mentioned that is difficult. So I think what a UX designer brings to the table when it comes to accessibility is the kind of existing value towards trying to understand their needs and already placing more importance on accessibility because they're already used to placing importance on the user. So
Mhm.
for example, a UX designer, if they have the budget, right, they will try to engage with these people with their accessible needs and try to allow them to participate in the design process. But
Mhm.
if there's no budget, the UX designer can still try to create a culture that focuses on accessibility and designing for accessibility.
Mhm.
And a good example would be like, let's make sure that our website is, you know, complies with WCAG guidelines or WCAG guidelines, which is kind of making sure that your website is mostly accessible to people with accessibility needs. And the reason why they're guidelines is, as I mentioned, because you can't be too specific. Like
Yeah.
they're not like make this to make it accessible. It's like people with disabilities have these needs, so
Mhm.
design for them, right? And then it takes a UX designer to do that.
Right.
Um, and when it comes to, I guess, the other part of the question of kind of what a UX designer can deliver to academics and especially academics working with oral history,
Mhm.
um, I think that a lot of academics and research teams these days are moving more and more towards creating something that is consumable for the public. That
Yes.
doesn't mean I want to sell something. That means like, as I mentioned, websites, digital exhibits, right?
Mhm.
And so whenever you're bringing something to the public who doesn't have the same specific knowledge that you have and
Mhm.
familiarity with this kind of content and research, I think the idea of introducing user-centric design and design thinking will always be helpful because you're presenting a view that challenges your view and challenges your assumption that the user might think like you and know as much as you. And
Right.
that ensures that your website, your digital exhibit, whatever you create to mobilize your research is intuitive and easy to use. And the more intuitive and easy and pleasant it is to use, the more people will engage with it, which brings more attention to your research.
Yes, I want to leave it there because I think that was the perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Peter, for
Mhm.
agreeing to sit with me and impart all of this fantastic wisdom on me and all of the inevitable listeners to this little project here. It the work you're doing is so cool, so fantastic, and as somebody who comes from a bit more of that traditional, boring academic who doesn't know what to do with all of this fantastic wealth of knowledge, the way that you're able to kind of plan on behalf of the team so that we can get this information out there in the most user friendly and publicly accessible way is just fantastic to see. And
Yeah.
I'm very excited to see how it ends up because even your prototype, I would publish that. Just like this looks great.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Uh,
But I do also want to bring to light, I think the interview has focused a lot on UX design, which is great, but I also want to leave with a note that a UX designer never works alone.
mhm,
A UX designer is also only able to deliver its maximum value when when the academic team, like the research team, is on board and engaged. they also need the graphic designer or an illustrator to deliver the content. They also need the developer to kind of actually create what they design. So I just want to also stress the idea that a UX designer is a very, very collaborative
Mhm.
per profession or career.
Mhm.
And it's able to kind of work best within a greater team.
Yeah, well, perfect for the collaboratory then.
Yeah,
In the
exactly.
name.
Yeah, in the
Uh,
name, yeah.